Hello everyone, Chris Switten here. Today's video I'd like to talk a little bit about touring abroad. You know, in my career I've been very fortunate. I've gotten to travel all over Europe, parts of Russia, former Soviet bloc countries, the Middle East, and even a couple of war zones. And each of those trips presented themselves with their own unique challenges. A lot of this stuff is not specific to musicians, but I feel like as a musician or an entertainer, you cultivate your image to be different, to stand out. So if you stand out in your own country, odds are you're really going to stand out when you visit another country. We have a lot to unpack, so let's dive right in. The first thing I would say in the planning stages of any trip like this is know your destination. Learn as much as you can about the local culture, the climate, all of these things. It's very important. Of course, you don't want to pack a suitcase full of t-shirts and shorts to go to a country that has 14 inches of snow on the ground. But likewise, you want to think about the countries you'll be transitioning to on the way to your destination. You never know when you might have a layover and spend some time in a country that does have 14 inches of snow on the ground. So I'd recommend, keep a light jacket, a sweater, something like that. Put it in your carry-on bag. That way, if you can't access your checked luggage, you still have a way to stay warm in those situations. Next, it is very important to know something about the currency exchange rate. You need to specify when you book a gig of this nature, what currency are you going to be paid in? I have known guys who have gotten very excited about the opportunity to travel to Europe. They are excited to have a working vacation and visit some exotic location like that, and they end up selling themselves short. They booked the gig 6 or 8 months down the road. Within that 6 to 8 month time period, the local currency tanked. Once they were paid in local currency and paid any fees associated with converting that currency to US dollars, they lost a significant amount of money on the trip. So that's something to bear in mind when you're just booking a trip of this nature. That brings me to my next point. I always recommend to have some understanding of the socioeconomics of your destination or the countries you'll be visiting. If you're visiting a first world or westernized country, odds are it's not going to be too dissimilar to what you're used to if you're from the United States. But if you're going to be traveling in countries that say are former communist countries, such as like Soviet bloc countries, many of them are very socioeconomically depressed. In my experience in those situations, you never know when you might have to bribe a baggage handler or a customs official to get into or out of the country and to get your gear into and out of a country. That brings me to my next point. We'll talk a little bit about traveling with your gear. Speaking of bribes, one story I'd like to relate was when I went to Afghanistan. We traveled into Kyrgyzstan, or the Kyrgyz Republic, and that was the jumping off point to head on into Afghanistan. We were there, stayed a few days at the Manas Air Force Base in Almaty, Kyrgyzstan. Kyrgyzstan is a former communist country under Soviet rule, and they're a very poor country. When we entered the country, we paid, as best I can recall, about $25 a piece for our visas. The visa was good for 30 days. We were going to be leaving before 30 days was up, so it didn't seem like it would be a problem. Our local military liaisons did warn us when we went to leave that we might run into some issues. After checking our luggage, going through security, getting into the secure area, we were told that we owed $600 in overage charges for our baggage and our checked luggage. Fortunately, the United States government and military understands these situations, and when you're traveling like that to entertain the troops, they do make funds available for these types of incidentals. They put funds into essentially an escrow account that you have access to. The problem was that the currency exchange area was outside of the secure area in the airport. So we had to exit that secure area, go withdraw the cash, return, go back through the airport security to go in and pay. And to the best of my recollection, we were able to get $1,000 cash. We returned to the secure area. We paid the $600. At this point, we were basically late for our flight. So we get to the gate, encounter the customs officials, and this lady in very broken English proceeded to tell us that our visas were only good for entering the country. She said that we would have to buy another special visa to exit the country, and those visas would be $600 per person. At that point, the guy who was handling the money and the situation and talking to the lady proceeded to tell her that all we had was $400 cash on us. We had already exited the secured area one time to go to the currency exchange to get that money. We were more than happy to do it again, but they were already holding the plane for us. We didn't want to miss our connecting flight in Moscow, so we asked if there was anything else that we might be able to do. The conversation flagged a little bit there, and as they were talking, my friend, he took the $400 we had remaining, put it inside his passport, closed the passport, slid it across the desk. The lady opened the passport as she was talking, pulled the $400 out, in very broken English said something to the effect that this is highly unorthodox as she slipped the $400 into her pocket, but she went ahead, stamped our passports, told us to have a nice trip, and allowed us to board the plane. Unfortunately, this really is a sad reality in many countries. This sort of thing does happen, and in those situations, there's really nothing that you can do about it. You argue with them too much, you might find that you're not going to be leaving that country anytime soon. Next, as far as traveling with gear, I want to talk a little bit about carrying on your instrument versus checking your instrument. Early on, I would carry my instrument in a regular violin case, which is definitely not suitable to be checked or placed underneath the plane. The problem with that was, the more I flew, the more I found myself in situations where I was on these smaller commuter jets, like the little Embraer jets, which have less overhead storage space. So if you weren't early to board the plane, you might find yourself in a situation where they required you to gate check your carry-on when you boarded the plane. In those situations, they'll stick a tag on it, put it underneath the plane, and with all the rest of the checked luggage, and you better hope that it survives. In response to this, I went ahead and got myself a large flight case that would hold 2 violins, and from that point on, I simply checked my instruments. Of course, I wouldn't travel with anything that has a lot of sentimental value or a lot of value in general. You never know when something's going to happen to it. That's why I started playing this. This is actually a $150 Chinese violin. Of course, I've played it for so many years. I would really hate it if anything happened to it. But by the same token, it's still not a 200-year-old Italian violin. For years, I've heard people talk about detuning instruments and things like that in preparation for flying. I personally have never done anything special. Of course, with a violin, you have a sound post in here that remains in place simply by the tension of the strings and the grace of God, honestly. And taking all the strings off this instrument, just setting here, you run the risk of that sound post falling over. It's tedious to set it back up, and you can move it just a millimeter and completely change the entire tone of the instrument. So it's really not an option with violins anyway. I've never had any issues. I always had very good luck. I was impressed and surprised whenever traveling to the Middle East. I remember going into Kuwait. We had to change airlines 4 or 5 times between here and there. It was a 48-hour flight. I was amazed that my luggage even got there at the same time I did. And when I opened up my case, not only was my violin and everything completely fine, it was even still in tune. My fiddle was lost briefly. Coming back from Europe, we landed in Austin about 11 o'clock at night. I had a 10 a.m. bus call the next day. We were going down the road for 4 or 5 days. And when we arrived, our instruments did not. I believe it was my fiddle. I was working for Kevin Fowler at the time. I believe it was my fiddle, Kevin's guitar, and our bass player, or was it our bass player? Anyway, one of the other guys' instrument as well didn't show up. And they just told us to go on home. They said that they had located it, that it was still at Heathrow in London, and they would get it on the next flight in and get it to us as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, the next morning when we boarded the bus to head out on the road, they still hadn't arrived. And about an hour after we left town, we got a phone call, and they said that our stuff was there. And we were fortunate in that instance that the opener that we had on the show that night was really good friends of ours, and they were likewise based there in Austin. And they were leaving later, a little later than we were, so we called them. They stopped by the airport and picked our stuff up for us and brought it on down to sound check. I don't remember the particulars of it, but I do recall at some point on some trip, one instance where somebody did detune a guitar. I don't really remember a whole lot about it. Out of all the trips that I've made, I only recall one instance where a fellow detuned a guitar in order to fly it. I don't even particularly remember what trip it was on or who it was. I just know that it did occur at one point. In those situations, whenever you go to check an instrument, you can ask that they open the case and look at the instrument in your presence. After which, when they close it all up, latch it together, lock the case if you wish. They generally have a roll of TSA tape that is official. They'll give you some of that. You can put that over the latches of your instrument, and that signifies that it has been searched, it has been cleared, and there is no reason for them to open your case again from that point forward. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit about personal safety. You know, as Americans, we are kind of loud. Think about going into a restaurant, busy, it's dinner time, and you're almost having to yell over the crowd to talk to someone sitting across the table from you. In my experience, most countries are not like that. Most of the places I've been, people are more quiet, more reserved, and I think that has a lot to do with why people from certain countries aren't particularly fond of us as Americans. They think we're loud, boisterous, and obnoxious, quite honestly. I've been told that multiple times by people in various countries. That being said, I recommend be quiet and aware. Keep your head on a swivel. Pay attention, especially if you're in a country where you do not understand the language. You're going to have to pay a lot of attention to nonverbal cues and body language, and just try to read people. Beyond that, you really don't want to call a lot of attention to yourself and make it obvious that you're from somewhere else. Lastly, I would say just be respectful. Be respectful of the local culture, be respectful of the people, and respect yourself and your country. Remember, whether you like it or not, you are a representative of your country when you are in another country. Also, be prepared for things not to necessarily go as planned. It just happens. It's just how it is. The more flexible you can be, the better off you're going to be. And as always, if you need some fiddle tracks, some mandolin tracks, some string parts, please let me know. I would love to work with you, work on your album project. Just let me know. It'd be a lot of fun. Also, if you're interested in violin or fiddle lessons, please hit me up. We can do those remotely. We can work around your schedule and make it real simple. So please like, subscribe, and share. I want to grow this channel as much as possible and continue making these videos. So until next time, have a wonderful day, a wonderful week, and keep on picking.